Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today, to discuss with you our final part for the naval warfare on this series so far, which is now an exploration of an essay question. We've gone over loads of detail, we've gone over Nelson, the types of ships, and some key battles and tactics that were used across the era. And now for those of you who are students who are using this to help with studying for your examinations, especially those at A level, this will be here to help you and how we write essays. So if you haven't already, do make sure you checked out our previous videos to learn all that prior context. And I would also strongly recommend you've done some wider reading as well. Again, the more knowledge you know, the better you do on these examinations. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So in this video, what we're going to look at is a essay question. And there are various essay questions you can experience, but this is one I've chosen that we can go through, and it covers the whole of our studies we've done so far, help you not only consolidate your knowledge, but also understand how you could apply it in an examination setting. And the question we're going to look at is this one. Was Nelson the main reason for British naval success during the French Wars? And because it says French Wars, we're looking at the whole era we've studied, which is from 1793 to 1815. So what this video will cover is, of course, basically the breaking down of an essay question, what these tend to be like, a recommendation from myself for how you could structure them and how you could write them, and then a more in-depth look into how you can write an essay for this specific question. Again, I will stress now from the start, that information will help with this precise question. Again, if we change this question just a little bit, instead of Nelson, it was technology, and if instead of French wars, it was a narrow battle like Cape St. Vincent, Trafalgar, Aboukir Bay, then of course how you'd answer the question will change massively. So let's get ourselves into it. Feel free to write down this question as well. If you like, maybe even have a jot down of some ideas and think for yourself, what knowledge will you bring to this question to help answer it? So yes, there's our essay question. And so I'm going to break it down into a recommendation of one potential way that you could answer it. Again, the way I'm suggesting here is for A-level skills and upwards. The structure of how we answer a question, what we're looking for, our intros, our factors, our conclusion and judgment, those still are roughly the same. What we should notice with this question is it's asking us to assess the validity of a view, and it gives us that view straight away. It's telling us Nelson's leadership was the main reason for British naval success. That makes up what's called your topic sentence. So this is what I've recommended here. This is the general structure I recommend for any paragraph that you're answering, conclusion not included though. And that's to use heal. So first off, you want to have a topic sentence, which the examiners will always give to you because it's in the question that they've given, whether it's about Nelson's leadership, technology, something else. It's in the question, it's given to you and should be noted. So Nelson's leadership is the factor they want us to consider. And whenever you answer a question, it's strongly recommended you start with the factor in the question. Again, you can choose other ones when you're planning and as your essay writing is going on. But if you don't consider the factor in the question, your answer does not answer the question, simple as that, because you're not doing the one thing they've actually directly asked for, which is to assess the view that Nelson's leadership was the main reason. So just to not talk about it is what's called an argument by omission. It's a complete flaw because you're not considering what they want you to look at. The second thing is then your evidence. This is all the contextual knowledge that we've gathered across our series and you and your wider reading to help you answer this question. Now, because of the timeline we're given here, 1793 to 1815, everything we've studied is perfectly on offer. As long as you make sure what you reference has happened within the time of those dates, it's perfectly valid for the question and can be included. This is why it's very important to look at that timeline, the years 1793 to 1815. This is so important. Because if this is a different year, if this is 1805 to 1815, suddenly there's a different style of answer here. Or if it's just the 1790s, so you need to be really aware of that when you're answering. And it takes us over to what the actual thing is, which is Britain's naval success. So you've got to think with a main reason question. How is Nelson's leadership causing success? First off, does it? The obvious answer probably is yes. But then the hard part is the how. And that's why analysis is so important as well. Because once you've given your topic sentence, once you've given your evidence, you then need to actually analyze it and prove the case. So it's all good you saying Nelson's leadership was brilliant during the wars because he was there at Trafalgar. This happened crossing the T. He attacked. We destroyed the French fleet. We split them up with the Spanish. Blah blah blah. If you're just rimming off the context, that's good, but you're not doing the analysis part. Because again, it's asking us to assess. It's not saying tell us about Nelson's leadership. It wants you to assess. All right, that's good. He was at Trafalgar. He crossed the T. He used a pell mell style. but how? How did that cause success? And that's why analysis is so important. And the final way to finish the paragraph would then be to link back to the question. Because again, once you think about how much you're going to write for this, half a side to a full side of A4, let's say, a good few hundred words for each paragraph. You can kind of get lost in your narrative and story. And so you've got to do what's called cohesive focus. You've got to link back to the question, right? I've done my analysis, done my evidence. Oh, yes. And yes, and therefore it's clear XYZ is why his leadership caused success. And you've got to have that little link at the end to make sure it's all focused, all nicely wrapped up. And again, take each of your factors with this. If you get four factors in the essay, the one in the question, and three of your own, you're probably going to do really, really well here in terms of the depth as well as breadth of knowledge you're going to cover. Let's consider what factors we can talk about. So first off, they've actually already told us Nelson leadership. That's a given. That's one they're going to want you to include. If you didn't include this one, the examiner would be very, very worried. But you'll notice is that the factors are what we call thematic. It's not a case of, oh, let's look at various battles. Let's look at Toulon, Cape St. Vincent, Copenhagen, and Trafalgar. The thing the examiners want to see is thematic factors. So they've already given you one, Nelson leadership. So you've got to think, what else across the era is going to cause success? And the few I've suggested are first off, other leaders. You should remember throughout our series, we've mentioned other leaders that have been around. We mentioned Cuthbert Collingwood, we had Admiral Hood, there are others as well that you may have gone away and studied in greater detail with the further reading. You can now show that knowledge. Yes, we can get fixated on Nelson because of his genius at Trafalgar and the martyrdom of him dying there. But again, he wasn't the only leader for the era. The third factor you can consider is the Royal Navy itself. I mean, Nelson's just one man. I mean, at the end of the day, he relies on the Marines, the seamen, and of course the ships and cannons that are actually used in the fleet. So maybe the Royal Navy's economy and its industrial strength is what enables it to be so successful rather than just the people who are on the ship. And the fourth factor we can look at are French and Spanish mistakes. I will note straight away the view in this question is Britain's naval success in the French wars. It's one slight way this question could change could be against the French in the years 1793 to 1815. If it had said against the French, you may not necessarily consider Spanish or other nations' errors, like the Dutch, for example, at Copenhagen. So you've got to be really aware of the question. What's it allowing you to talk about? Now, what's the scope of things you can consider? And this one's quite nice because, yes, it's the French wars, but it's not saying you can't explicitly talk about the French, Spanish, and other nations. So you can consider all of them, their leaders, their own ships and styles, and maybe their own tactics. So there are your four factors, and then once you've got all four down, you then to finish with a conclusive judgment and decide, right, go back to the question, was Nelson's leadership the main reasons for success? Yes, you may concede that it is a big reason, but for this question, was it the main reason? That's what you've really got to answer here. ATQ, answer the question at all times. Some other general advice we can follow as well is to remember we have to try and assess the whole timeline. They've given us quite a broad range here, and so they don't need to look at just one battle. So if you come into this and think, oh, I know loads about Trafalgar, I'll just talk about Trafalgar. That covers all the factors. Nelson leadership, others were there like Collingwood, the Royal Navy's size, and the French and Spanish's blunders with Villeneuve and Gravina. Okay, that's great, but it's only 1 year. We have over 20 years to play with here. And so they really want you to consider that breadth as well as depth of knowledge for this. So be aware you've got to bring in other things rather than just a range of factors. Another thing to consider, this is criteria now to help with your analysis, is were these factors causes of long-term or short-term success? Nelson was brilliant at Trafalgar, he had some good battles between 1798 and 1805, but he of course dies at Trafalgar. So he doesn't necessarily cover the whole timeline from 1806 to 1815, for instance. So could that actually limit his ability to be successful across the timeline? There is some debate there, but this is the kind of thing the examiners want to see. You being nuanced, you being critical, analytical, rather than just stating stuff you learned in class. So that's an overview there of how you could potentially answer this question. Let's go into some detail now of how you may actually expand on those factors. If you like, you can of course pause the video and maybe try and recall knowledge you have yourself independently. Maybe get your notes together, get them organized, bulleted lists, mind maps, all these kind of things before looking at my answers. It's a good test, I think, to test yourself. How much have you learned across this video series and from your wider reading as well? Once you're ready, feel free to play the video again and I'll see you for our first factor. So first off, let's look at Nelson's leadership. So Nelson, he's quite a very successful leader in this era. We've looked at numerous campaigns, some in more detail than others. But for instance, we looked at Abukir Bay during the Battle of the Nile in 1798. He had a successful fight against Napoleon's fleet. He had a brilliant surprise attack on him, wiped out most of their ships. Over 14 of the ships were destroyed at the fleet there. He also shows dynamic success as well against the Dutch at Copenhagen. He engages in siege warfare. He intensely bombards the capital and forces them to submit. Now, some could say he went a bit too far. But all the same, by him bombing to the extent he did, really trying to overwhelm them with this sheer sense of destruction, it did wipe out the Dutch and made them break their alliance with the French and concede. So that was a big victory for the British in 1801. And of course, we can't ignore this one, but it is, of course, his best victory ever, which was Trafalgar. His pell-mell attack using the line ahead style of two columns to completely break down the French and Spanish fleet. It was a high-risk strategy. It was quite dangerous, but he trusted in his men, he trusted in his concept, and he did secure an incredible victory there that did wipe out the French and Spanish. I have to admit this, it did secure absolute dominance for the British during the rest of the era. So there's three key battles you can make reference to and cover a wide range of his tactical as well as personal leadership. And speaking of Nelson, he also pioneers success in how Marines should be treated as well. The Nelson touch, treating them as his band of brothers. Rather than using a cat o' nine tails to beat them, he instead shows them respect. He trusts his captains to make their own decisions, to act independent, and therefore feel that trust, feel that respect, and go on to have success themselves. And this, of course, makes them more coordinated. They all have very simple plans, they all know to follow their captains. And I don't see this is such an important thing. When you have a massive fleet, all being affected by the weather, the wind, the light of the day or the night, to have this coordination is so important in combat. And so it's a testament to Nelson's style of leadership that they, of course, have some great success as well. And this is carried on with the likes of Cuthbert Collingwood afterwards, after Nelson's death. So it's a long term thing to consider. It's across the whole era. And again, Nelson's commitment to his principles, yes, his contemporaries considered him a maverick, but all the same, he was having massive success. And it's from that success the Royal Navy became the strongest navy in the world. We have to consider that as well. There's clear long term proof that Nelson's style, his pell mell principle, this maverick going against orders, having trust in his men, was indeed the path to success. Although we have to admit there's arguably some weaknesses to Nelson here. He wasn't perfect. He did suffer defeats in his life. Again, he lost an eye and an arm in combat, especially at Tenerife. So he's not perfect. His aggressive style can backfire. And we have to admit, in doing what he did at Trafalgar, he did lose his life and there were many casualties. So it was a dangerous style of combat to do. Perhaps his high risk, high reward strategy could very easily falter as much as it could succeed. We also, of course, have the timeline issue. As you can see from our key dates, we looked at the between 1798 and 1805. He is without a doubt the greatest naval commander the British have ever seen, and he is the most active and the most successful. But before that, he's not even a full admiral yet. It's like Hood and Jervis who are the ones in command, not him. Yes, he's present at some battles, particularly Cape St. Vincent, but he's not the leader in that part of the era. And of course, he dies in 1805. So in 1806 to 1815, some can make an argument that again he's not there. So is it fair to say he was the biggest factor across the whole era when he's not there for, you could argue, over half of it? But this is all just one man, one factor. Let's consider the other ones and see if Nelson's not the main reason. Are there other ones? So let's consider some of the other naval leaders. As I said there, Nelson was not the main commander in the early years. That was actually Admiral Hood. Admiral Hood is the one who is leading the British fleet at Toulon. He actually starts the success against the French in 1893. There are other battles as well with the likes of Jervis. We have Cape St. Vincent, where yes, Nelson's there and he does have some success, but he's not the leader. He's not the one in command here. And his maverick style is it's not the go-to tactic yet. Broadside is still the way to go. Pell-mells crossing the T are not necessarily the norm yet. And so you could argue that in the early year it's not him. There are, of course, other commanders later on as well. Cuthbert Collingwood, he's also throughout the era. He's there at Cape St. Vincent, just like Nelson is, and he's just as successful, even though he's nowhere near as talked about. And unlike Nelson, he actually survives at Trafalgar as well. He goes on to lead the fleets beyond that, and therefore has a much longer legacy. So you could actually look to Collingwood and say actually because Nelson was mortally wounded, it's Collingwood who goes on to secure the success at Trafalgar, not him. And the final one is actually his tactics as well. Even when Nelson's pell-mell chaotic brawl style becomes the norm in the early 1800s, it's actually not even his. He learned that from Admiral Hood, some tactics that were trained under him in the early 1790s, who himself was innovating ideas from the American Revolutionary War, Admiral Rodney, way before our timeline. Yes, it is before the timeline, but I think it's worth noting that Nelson's actions, he's building on the legacy of other commanders, Rodney, Hood, and then Collingwood goes build on Nelson post his death. So again, maybe it's more fair to say that it's not that we shouldn't just look at one leader and get fixated on the great man style of history. That's just one man who wins all the success. Maybe it's a combination of the British naval leaders that actually brings about that, and that could be a brilliant way to challenge the question and kind of say, right, it's not just Nelson, chain of command in the Royal Navy that enables success, the brilliancy of not just one, but several naval leaders. And speaking of the Royal Navy, let's consider the technology as well, because yes, we talk about how brilliant these commanders are and how they have some good successes, but this is all built on the back of the Royal Navy itself, the massive ships of the line, the battleships they develop over the years. So we have to look at the foresight of the British government before the era in the 1780s, and of course beyond as the era goes on. They're the ones who are investing millions and billions of pounds into the Royal Navy itself. They're the ones who are using their industrialized economy of the nation to build these ships, to build the cannons, and make them as powerful as they actually are. Again, a key principle of naval combat, to quickly remind us, is it's not necessarily he who has the most ships, it is he who has the most cannons. And of course, the most cannons are the ones on the biggest ships. And so, to look at the HMS Victory, Nelson's own ship of the line, that had hundreds of cannons on it because the British government had invested in naval development to make it and, of course, design it. Again, think of course of the other developments as well. We have the double firing cannons later in the era, the gun stocks that replaced the flint stock to allow for faster firing, and of course the coppering over all the hulls. Yes, they're still a bit more vulnerable at the front and back of the ship, but when they're firing broadside and taking on the shot, they have more defense than the majority of the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch fleets ever did. We even have some developments in their signaling technology. So, of course, we have their flags that they want to keep visible, but also how they communicate across the fleets in battle. Because again, it's a long distance they've got to try and communicate over. And as we established, the best combat are the ones who are closer together. So, having this improved signaling technology gave the British fleet a decisive advantage at various battles, especially Trafalgar. It's how they were able to stay so coordinated and so in sync with one another, even after Nelson is wounded. So we've got to consider this here. Maybe technology is a clear factor. It's the strength of the British economy to make so many ships of the line. It's the vast amount of cannons, and of course the coppering and signaling technology that enable them to be so successful. But there is one more factor to consider, which rather than praising Nelson, the other leaders, or the Royal Navy itself, maybe the British success came about because the French and Spanish simply weren't very good. So indeed, we've got some key areas to look at. First off, the French fleets were, we have to admit this, inferior to Britain's industrialized technology. They didn't have anywhere near as many throughout the era. The British government, before Napoleon's rule and after, put much more focus into land warfare, building their artillery batteries, and using things like the levée en masse to conscript loads of soldiers for their infantry. So again, the navy was quite secondary to French ambitions, and so therefore, because of that, they actually do have less ships of the line, and in some ways, you could argue, are starting at a technological disadvantage against the Royal Navy. We also have the leaders themselves. They're not really, I mean, compared to Nelson and Hood and Collingwood, they're arguably nowhere near as good. Villeneuve, as we saw, was tactically inept. He was blundering many attempts. He blundered alliances with the Dutch at Copenhagen. He couldn't really break out of many blockades very well. And of course, he had his big blundering that happened at Trafalgar. He simply could not maintain the continental system that Napoleon was trying to establish to weaken British trading. To point out some flaws with Napoleon as well. He didn't trust Villeneuve. He was interfering too much in his naval efforts. And of course, Napoleon's not even a naval expert. He's a master of artillery. So he doesn't know, he doesn't fully understand things like the terminology for how fleets move, like what the hell line ahead and line abreast mean. He doesn't understand how the weather is such a huge factor in how ships can maneuver at certain speeds. And this really hurts the ability of the French fleet to even do any success because he's interfering and not trusting in the leaders that are actually in command. This is in big contrast to Prime Minister William Pitt, who is trusting in Nelson and allowing him to do his duty, along with the other commanders as well, rather than interfering and weakening their capability in combat. And perhaps just to really rub it in even more for Napoleon, he actually suffers a big blunder at Abukir Bay, leaving Africa with exposed and letting most of them be destroyed by Nelson's own fleet in 1798. And lastly, because of the wording of the question, you can consider some Spanish errors as well. You have Gravina and the Spanish fleet who do pair up with Villeneuve and, of course, provide assistance at Trafalgar. And in doing so, they give themselves a numerical advantage over Nelson and Collingwood's fleets. But they don't take advantage of that. They instead just do a typical defensive broadside tactic, and instead of pressing the issue and taking advantage of the fact they've got more ships, they in some ways trust themselves to soak up Nelson's pell-mell charge with his two-line column, but it doesn't work, leads to a disaster for the Spanish and the French. In fact, it's interesting to note Cuthbert Collingwood had a lot more success against the Spanish than Nelson was having against the French earlier in the day. So you actually could argue, you could even take this even further and say the Spanish were weaker than the French despite all this effort to make them allies. So that's our four factors we've looked at there. Let's bring them all together and see if we can finally give a conclusive judgment to answer this question. So what is our overall judgment then? Let's go back to that question. Let's link back as we said we should be doing to connect and answer this issue. So here we go. Nelson, we can certainly say, was a distinct cause of success, especially between 1798 and 1805. However, when assessing the whole timeline, it does reveal a weakness in Nelson as a factor. He is absent after 1805 because of his death, and he isn't the main commander before 1798. However, because of his successes, a big reason for Britain's naval hegemony that happens throughout it. And of course, he was still a factor at play, helping Hood and Jervis and others in 1793 and 98. Therefore, you may find it a reasonable conclusion to say that it is very valid that he indeed was the main reason for Britain's success. But of course, I do challenge you to disagree with me. I did give some hints throughout that maybe he's not the only one we can consider. You may change your mind and go, no, it actually is. We should look at the leaders as a collective and how Nelson inherits Hood's abilities and goes on to improve upon them, and how Collingwood goes on to build on Nelson's legacy after 1805. So you could see as a chain of ideas there. Maybe the technology, maybe it's the Royal Navy, that maybe it's because of the government's investment, that they are just simply built better. It's the economic argument. They have the most ships, the most cannons, and therefore have the most success. Or maybe it's the French and Spanish errors. Maybe Britain is the best, but it's the best of a bad bunch. It doesn't really have much competition when it comes to naval warfare. That's for you to decide, though. Or maybe you've got a fifth and secret factor you may want to share with me in the comments below. Feel free, as always, to do that. So just quickly wrap this up then. We'll kind of bring it together and just some things to consider now. Because all that information there was just for one essay question. But again, these are some tips you could use no matter the essay question you face. The most important one, as always, is answer the question. Keep linking to your inquiry, what's being asked about. Make sure you're focused on it. Don't just give me a narrative of the context. Explain, give the why, causes, main reasons, consequences, factors, criteria. This is so important to make your essay more analytical. You could even make sure you follow TEAL, topic, evidence, analysis, and link. This is a strong and surefire way to structure your paragraphs to make sure you're focused while giving evidence and analyzing. That is so important, especially with criteria. Look for thematic arguments as well. Don't think of it as in terms of battles or the year. Look at the factor in the question. Nelson's leadership, technology, errors, whatever it may be, and answer it around those themes. Design some for yourself. But again, if you do it with themes, you'll have a much better time answering the question. And that's what examiners want to see, especially in the A-level standard. They want to see some real thoughtful analysis here, not just a retelling of events that you've regurgitated from my video, from a PowerPoint, or from a book. And the final one, make sure you give that reason judgment. Again, it should flow. We should see in your introduction what you're going to tell us. Maybe you started the essay saying, "Oh yes, Nelson is the main reason, but we have to assess against these other ones just to be sure." And when you get to your conclusion, we've assessed all those reasons against this criteria, and despite all of that, Nelson remains the main reason. You've got to have that Lincoln narrative, that cohesive argument to make it really clear and precise. I hope that's proved really helpful for you there. Perhaps if you like, you can have a go at answering the question I've done with you in this video. It always makes a difference to write it in your own words and really have an answer for yourself, what it looks like, how you crafted it. and then go away and maybe practice another essay as well. I have a suggestion for you here. Perhaps you may want to go away and do this one. Assess the validity of the view that French errors, not Spanish, French errors were the main cause of British victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. So it's still assessing the validity, but you've got a different factor and you have a more narrow timeline. It's just Trafalgar in 1805. And so all these tips still apply, but the context you bring in will change. So, with all that said, thank you as always for watching. I do hope you found this quite useful. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to, of course, keep up with more videos like this. Do feel to ask me any questions below how you found this video series, how you're finding the contextual help, and of course, what's one tip from this video you think would be really helpful for you going forward in answering your essays and using your history in class and beyond. With all that said, this has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.